Hello friends, how are you? I'm Níðhöggr and today I'm going to talk about Níðhöggr and Jörmungandr and their meaning as religious symbols to pre-Christian and pre-Viking Scandinavians. Which means today I'm not going to speak about these two mythological creatures as symbols that represent destruction and chaos as it is often perceived after the Viking period. And that chaotic aspect reflected in these religious symbols indeed is quite noticeable in the literary sources. In fact, that's the exact point. When I did the video about the serpent of paganism, I have expressed that the serpent is one of the oldest religious symbols among ancient pagan cultures, as the animistic representation of the energy of the earth, the life force of the earth itself. And so, to this day, the serpent is still very much present in a variety of cultures who retained animistic aspects of the perspective of the spiritual and also retained pagan traditions. I have expressed in that video that the image of pagan gods fighting serpents and the portrayal of the serpent as the personification of evil in seemingly pagan myths is actually a Christian construction. You will notice that the serpent as a religious symbol in pagan cultures is quite widespread and can be found everywhere, which is why Christianity made a great effort and emphasis on the image of fighting the serpent and equated the serpent with the devil and with demonic women, precisely to dissuade the pagans from continue to venerate their primordial symbol by turning it into an evil symbol. There was indeed a great effort on the part of the church to demonize one of the most important pagan symbols, which is the serpent, precisely to end with the serpent cult. So, on the video about the serpent of paganism, I have expressed that the Scandinavian pagans would never portray Thor fighting the world serpent Jormungandr and trying to kill it for being an evil creature. The portrayal of pagan gods and heroes fighting serpents, stepping on them, killing serpents, or in any way expressing subjugation over the serpent is a Christian conception. A Christian motif, the triumph of Christianity over paganism. The sword that kills the serpent is the Christian cross triumphing over the very spiritual essence of paganism. Turning the old gods, the most important and most loved gods of the pagans, into warriors that destroy the very symbol of paganism, the very essence of pagan cultures, which is the serpent. If the gods people loved so much were capable of fighting the very essence of paganism, why would people continue to follow a religious symbol if even their beloved gods are against it? Paganism was twisted and turned against the pagans themselves. If pagans interiorized that the very symbol that expresses everything they are and everything they believed in is a symbol even despised by their own gods, then paganism itself would be easily put aside and the process of conversion would be much easier. So Thor fighting the serpent is a Christian motif, not pagan. So, this idea I have expressed naturally and fortunately raised some eyebrows and questions were asked. If the serpent is indeed a benevolent pagan symbol and the personification of the earth itself, why would Thor want to destroy it? And if Thor fighting the serpent is a Christian conception, why is that image in the sources and on Viking Age picture stones? So this is exactly what I'm going to focus on this video today. The sources and picture stones that contain the image of Thor fighting Jörmungandr and show you it is a Christian conception. To the Scandinavian pagans, their beloved god Thor would never try to capture and kill one of the most important symbols of paganism itself. But before I jump into Jörmungandr, I will also talk about Níðhöggr, because it is a pagan symbol entwined with Jörmungandr. So, this is what you can expect in today's video. I'm not going to explore the chaotic aspects of these two mythological creatures, because those are later conceptions. I will explore these two religious symbols as one and as the expression of the pagan mentality before Christian influences upon the religious panorama of pagan Scandinavia. Now, just one other thing I think it is important to express here before we start this video. I take the opportunity to talk about Norse mythology in general in a few words and the evolution of myth, because it's important to take that in mind always when dealing with Norse mythology. Norse mythology is something that has evolved over a long period. The stories we know of today are by no means the same stories that were being told 1,000 years ago, and not the same 1,000 years ago before that. The stories have been told and retold on countless occasions. Many elements to the stories have been added throughout the ages. Some elements have disappeared, others remained, and others forced even more change. Many details in the stories have been changed for the purpose of beautifying the accounts, and even for poetic purposes. There are naturally many contradictions. We also have the factor of transmission, the changing of the stories through oral tradition, like the game of the broken phone. And the message reaches a certain point that has absolutely nothing to do with the original message. Also, writing down the stories, the amount of errors and mistakes in translations and biases over the centuries, adapting the stories to new religious expressions in each era, each period, deliberated distortions and suppressions of the accounts. This is not just within Norse mythology, obviously, but all mythologies. And what we read nowadays is not the expression of the original pagan mind, but artificial constructions due to all the previous reasons and factors spoken before. The mythologies we read today are constructions that contain some traces of the pagan mentality, but very much changed, because don't forget that the mythologies we are so familiar with were compiled by Christian clerical workers and monks and a variety of people whose own religions and entire mentality were already very much culturally far from the pagan past. So in a way, these myths we have in our hands, so beautifully put together, have solidified into something that they never really were from the beginning, from their original expressions. The Norse did not know about Norse myths. The Greeks did not know about Greek myths. The Celts did not know about Celtic myths. These myths we link to a specific culture are things we have created through academic work, condensing and compiling tales for the purpose of study of the evolution of these cultures and their religions. This is a work still in progress. It will always be. There isn't a single truth in the myths. The myths we have are not by any means the reality of the past. Such literary works alongside archaeology give us clues to try to reach the origins of the meaning and mentality of these cultures, trying to go far back as much as we can to understand the ancient mentalities as they were and not as we have constructed them to be. You need to have that in mind always when dealing with any mythology. which is why I say Thor never wanted to kill Jörmungandr, and both Jormungandr and Níðhöggr were never personifications of chaos and evil to pre-Christian and even pre-Viking Scandinavians. As far back as we can go, these two mythological entities are one and the same from a more remote past and animistic understanding of the very earth, not as inanimate matter, but as an animated living spiritual entity capable of nourishment, creating and sustaining life. With this being said, let's get started. To ancient pagan cultures, there was this animistic perspective that the earth itself was a living spiritual entity. Its power coming from the very depths of the earth was expressed in a variety of areas. Our ancestors made those areas their cult places, where the power, the energy of the earth was felt more intensely. Our ancestors perceived that the earth had energy. It was a living entity, and such energy, such a life force came from the underground, from its very core. As the first spiritualities were animistic in nature, such a life force was represented as a serpent. Not only because the serpent slithers in and out of the earth, and on an undulating manner, and the energy of the earth was perceived to come in waves as well, but the blood of the earth, that which gives life, was water, coming from the underground. Water slithering out of the earth just like a serpent. And you have probably noticed by now that in prehistory the great majority of cult places or sacred places were always near a body of water. Lakes, springs, rivers, mostly bottomless lakes, springs coming out of the ground, wells, rivers coming in and out of a cave, always linked to the underground. Within the Nordic tradition, this generator of force, this life and energy of the earth was called a dragon, a creature whose function is to transmit life and energy to the earth and to the creatures living in it, channeling energy. What you need to understand about the figure of the dragon is that it is no more than a winged serpent. A winged serpent is called a dragon. The serpent was the animistic spiritual motif representative of the energy and life of the earth passed on to all living creatures, while the dragon was a serpent with wings. And when wings were attributed to an animal in the religious panorama, it meant the animal belonged to the supernatural, to the other world, the spiritual world. That's what the dragon is, a serpent with wings, which means it has the exact same spiritual and religious functions of the regular serpent, but its powers are expressed in the underworld, within the earth. A dragon is a winged serpent of the world of the spirits, nourishing that reality, the same way the regular serpent nourishes the surface. It's the exact same creature and the exact same religious motif. When the serpent goes down into the earth to continue to channel energy into the world of the spirits, it gains wings and therefore becomes a dragon. To the Nordic peoples, just like other pagan cultures, in the areas the life force of the earth was expressed, they made representations of serpents, labyrinths, spirals, to represent the life force of the earth in those places. So you will see a lot of representations of serpents and spiral motifs, serpent-like motifs in a variety of cultic places and sacred places to mark the presence of the life force of the earth, which was the divine power mostly praised by our pagan ancestors. All cultic places of the past, including Nordic ones, were built in accordance with the so-called dragon lines or serpent lines, which we nowadays call them ley lines, the flowing energy of the earth. Imagine it as a force web, or an endless web of energy and spiritual entities that compose that same web, and the cult places were built in specific points to provoke a reaction on that web of energy, to pull that energy for the benefit of those living in the surface. So, to the Nordic peoples, the generator of energy that made the web of energy was the dragon. It was Níðhöggr. Níðhöggr in the Norse myths is said to be the one full of hatred and represented as a dragon of death in Völuspá, said to drink the blood of the dead and eats their corpses. Pay close attention at that. In Grimnismal, Níðhöggr lives under the roots of Yggdrasil and gnaws on the roots. Snorre Sturluson repeats this idea expressed in Grimnismal in his Gylfaginning within his prose Edda, and repeats the passage within Völuspá, but in a different form, in which he tells Níðhöggr torments the dead in the spring Þvergelmir, and thus it becomes like the dragon in Christian visionary literature, with elements of hell-like places of punishment. So, you see this here, constant change of motifs and storytelling. Snorri was a Christian, and not only his work, the prose Edda, in this case, was greatly influenced by Christianized classical myths, but also from accounts of the Bible and the imagery of Christian mythology. Everything that is perceived to be a monster, especially when it comes to the figure of the dragon and serpent, Snorre gave evil attributes and purposes. We will see that when we talk about Jormungandr. Náströnd, which is an afterlife place, since it is the shore of corpses and an afterlife hole filled with serpents, it's also perceived as a place of punishment, a sort of hidden hell. We shall get to that. So, what we must retain from here is that Níðhöggr lives under or in the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of life. It lives in a spring called Þvergelmir, beneath one of the tree roots of Yggdrasil. From this spring come all waters of life that stretch across the 9 worlds. In fact, it is said that Níðhöggr can be found in Náströnd, to be more precise, sucking the blood of corpses who wash up on the shores. Now, this is when it gets interesting. As previously said, the source of life and the energy that flows, as perceived by ancient pagans, in many cases comes from within the earth in the form of water. When I have done the video about Náströnd, and I recommend you to watch it to better understand this subject and my arguments. I don't want to repeat everything I have said in almost 1 hour in that video. So please click on this upper corner if you can and do watch it. Anyway, on that video about Náströnd, I have expressed that Náströnd was wrongly portrayed as a place of punishment due to the fail in understanding the religious pagan motifs by the Christian compilers, who not only did not fully understood the pagan cultural past they were no longer familiar with, but also because as Christians they couldn't remain impartial and transformed Náströnd in a place of punishment. Since it is filled with serpents, it has a dragon and it is situated in the underworld, which in the Christian perspective it is hell, where Satan reigns and therefore where all deformed and demonic creatures, which are his creations, live alongside him, Satan. Náströnd, in a pagan sense, in fact, is the representation of the burial mound in the pagan perspective. In the near future, I'll have a video for you where I develop the cult of the burial mound within the cult of the dead for the Nordic pagans. The point here is that Náströnd is perceived to be the burial mound or the grave itself, the womb of the earth, to where the dead go. Náströnd is closely connected with the idea of rebirth. The grave is the reality in between the world of the living and the underworld. The dead enter and suffer a transformation and are reborn, becoming spiritual entities. What Scandinavians called Ulfar, elves, the Celts called fairies, fae folk, and the good people of the Irish, the Icelanders called the Huldfolk, the heathen people, and so on and so forth. The dead in the burial mound would go through a transformation, and in the case of Náströnd, this process of transformation was perceived as leaving the physical body behind, the líkr, and becoming serpents and going down into the underworld, the spiritual world, where such serpents would suffer another transformation and become spiritual entities suitable to live in the underworld, in the world of the spirits. This idea matches the many religious motifs and folklore of a variety of cultures, Germanic, Slavic, Lusitanian, Roman, and the belief that the ancestors would transform into serpents and visit their families. It was perceived that for the ancestors to wander about the world of the living in a physical form, that form was a serpent. And the serpent, until quite late in many pagan cultures, was praised as the symbol of the ancestors, the serpent guardian spirit of a family. Now, Náströnd, as you know, is the shore of corpses, and there are serpents everywhere. This matches the belief of rebirth and transformation within the burial mound. A shore filled with corpses, because the dead leave behind their physical, mortal condition and are transformed into serpents before they are transformed into something else. To the dead, it is given another physical appearance, another physical body, suitable to go in and out of the underworld and into the surface, maintaining contact with the living. Please do watch my video about Náströnd, and you will certainly better understand this. This was just summarizing a lot my conclusion on that video. Now, Nidhöggr lives in the underworld, within the earth, beneath the tree of life, not only in the great spring Hvergelmir, which is the source of life from which all waters of life come from, but he also lived in Náströnd, the place of transition, the place where the dead suffer a transformation and are reborn, because it is situated in the source of life, so the continuation of life after death. Níðhöggr is the very source of power, the life force of the earth residing in the spring of life, the spring this life force uses to spread even more life, all the rivers of life. And this idea of eating the corpses of the dead and sucking their blood is what Christians failed to understand. This is in fact a very pagan motif. Níðhöggr, as the source of life in the earth, as the force that provokes transformation of life, nourishes life, has the power to destroy the dead corpse and release the spirit within, the blood. As both life force and spirit were perceived by pagan cultures to reside in the blood. Níðhöggr isn't sucking blood. Níðhöggr is the life force of the earth itself that destroys the corpse through the process of decay and releases the spirit upon the underworld, takes out the spiritual form from the physical form. And this is a beautiful animistic pagan perspective. The fact that in Náströnd, where Níðhöggr resides, the dead go through a transformation and become serpents. Níðhöggr is the serpent of the earth, and the dead are turned into little serpents, its children. Níðhöggr is the life force of the earth, the force that nourishes all life, the spring Hvergelmir and all the rivers that flow from it. And the dead return to the original source of life, the earth, their mother, or rather, Níðhöggr is the generator of life within the earth itself, so not the earth as a whole, as a spiritual entity expressed in a variety of earth goddesses, but Níðhöggr is the very divine power of the earth itself, the very thing that channels energy and life, forcing transformation and evolution of both the living and the dead. Of course, we can argue with the very name of Níðhöggr. The term Nid is a well-known Old Norse term meant as an insult. It was a term for a social stigma implying the loss of honor, and to label something or someone as being evil and vile. Nid was the term for defamation and abuse. This is the exact point, actually. Whatever the pagans called the dragon generator of life force and power, certainly it wasn't Níðhöggr. Níðhöggr is what comes in the written sources. Written sources compiled and composed by Christians, giving the term Nid to the sacred dragon of the pagan Nordic people, as a form of slur, defamation, insult, abuse, and label it a vile creature. I doubt in pagan times this spiritual entity was called Níðhöggr. Now let's jump to Jörmungandr, the world serpent, or the serpent that envelops the world. And the very symbol of the serpent that bites its own tail is a symbol of protection. It is the representation of the eternity of life, both in the mortal plane and the spiritual plane. But as an important pagan symbol, Jörmungandr by Christian hands was transformed into an evil being and personification of chaos and destruction to be turned against the pagans. I do admit that if we explore the chaotic side of Jörmungandr, it is quite useful to once and for all end with the simplistic dualistic view of the world and all life. But on another video I shall talk about the chaotic aspects expressed in Jörmungandr and even Níðhöggr, since both are the same in a more remote pagan past. Because even as pagan symbols of life, energy, life force, the serpent motif can still be linked to the chaotic aspects of life, which is death, for instance, not as something evil, but something natural that needs to happen to force transformation and evolution. Chaos is meant to force the continuation of the cycle of life, to force change and growth, to avoid stagnation. So indeed, both Níðhöggr and Jörmungandr, in a pagan sense, are still connected to chaotic aspects of life. No doubt about that. But not as Christians have portrayed them. But about that on some other video. So, Jörmungandr is often translated to huge monster, which I do not agree with that at all. The word element Jormun is found in one of Odin's names as Jormungandr, meaning great one or mighty one. Also in the name Jormungandr, which is a name given to the earth itself, as we have in Jord, which is the earth mother of Thor. Pay close attention at that. Jormungandr is also reflected in Old Saxon Irminsul. It is the semi-etymological root which means world pillar. And we have the term Gandr, which means sorcery, magic, even wand, as a tool to express magic. Gandr is actually one of the most used terms in the sources to refer to magic in general. In fact, Gandr is almost always connected to Seidr, when it comes to the expression of the spiritual self or part of the spiritual, and send it forth, related to breath, send forth the spirit in chanting, and this Gandr is the spirit, the magical projectile. I have at least 2 videos about that, which I'll have to put down below in the description for you. Anyway, in a few words, Gandr in Seidr is seen as to be the shape of the spirit that has been sent forth, a magical projectile often associated with wind and breath. So we could also say that Gandr also represents spirit. In fact, in shamanism in Lapland, Gandr, or to be more precise, Gandus, is a helping spirit of the shaman, often related to divination, telling the shaman its own future, just as Seidr is essentially a divination ceremony. Christian missionaries in Lapland, in the process of converting the Sami, transformed the term gandos and gave it the same connotations they gave to the Norse Gandr. Since it was related to a helping spirit, it became an evil spirit, a demonic entity. So we can understand why Jörmungandr is translated to huge monster. Before Christian alterations in the association of words, Jormungandr is something mighty and magical at the same time, a spiritual entity of the earth, just like the goddess Jord, mother of Thor. But bigger, mightier, in the sense of being great, not in size but in power. Jormungandr was for the Nordic pagans their version of the serpent motif, as a force of the earth, an entity giver of life, power, energy, which is also expressed in magic. The very essence of the earth. What empowers life is often perceived as magic of the earth. The translation to huge monster is perceptible due to the changes of the meaning of the terms due to a new religious reality that even made alterations to language. Just imagine Christian missionaries telling you that some powerful magical entity you believe in is no longer acceptable, should no longer be praised, and they twist it and give it another meaning, another connotation. It becomes an evil entity. It becomes connected to evil. It is transformed into something you should not even mention. You continue to use the same name for it as you used before, in this case Gandr or Gandos, but the meaning changed. Let me give you two examples that I find very funny and it might be useful. The term troll in Scandinavia, it was used to refer to any magical creature or person possessor of magic. With Catholicism, in medieval Scandinavia and later on with Protestantism, the term troll gained another connotation, meant as a slur to those possessors of magic or practitioners of magic, sorcerers and witches. Troll became the term to refer to a monster, or a disfigured creature, deformed, even an evil entity, used in the same way Nid was used as an insult. We have another curiosity in northern Portugal. There is a sort of swear word people use in northern Portugal when you don't like something, when you get hurt, when you clearly show some discomfort and anger. And the term is carago. It's not as strong as saying fuck or shit, my apologies, but I need to compare it with something. But it enters in the category of swear words. Carago was in fact the name given to sorcerers and male witches, wizards, who worked with symbols to propitiate all sorts of beneficial effects, including the fertility of the land. But during the Middle Ages, there was a persecution to these caragos, and by law it was prohibited to be one, and with time the word became a swear word, much like the Swedish helvete. When you are extremely upset and you say helvete, hell, because the Norse underworld, hell, by Christian hands became a synonym with something evil, something bad, something you are not even supposed to say, therefore a swear word. So, you get the idea how even language and the meaning of words changes with religion, and the same thing happened with Jörmungandr. But now let's explore the myth of Thor fighting or trying to cause harm to Jörmungandr as a Christian motif and not pagan. So we have that typical image of Thor fighting the world serpent or trying to catch it, and this perception that Thor is the ultimate champion fighting all sorts of evil creatures to save the world from the chaotic and destructive forces that might cause harm to humanity and life itself. and destabilize the divine order. And I've made my statements that that image is a Christian construction and not a pagan one. I have given my previous arguments, and now let's explore the images we have of Thor fighting or fishing the world serpent. Actually, before I show you those images, let me tell you something that I think it's important for you to understand. When it comes to Scandinavian picture stones, they are associated with the dead. They are memorial stones, and they depict stories. It's not a random set of images, but there is always a story carved on the stones, and the great majority of those stories are mythological accounts or heroic tales, something of the religious world and folklore that has some deep significance, and it was expressed on the stone and dedicated to the deceased. So, here's one example I absolutely love, which is the Smiss picture stone of Gotland, dating before the Viking Age, or perhaps I should say late Iron Age and the very last moments just before the beginning of the Viking period. In other words, this picture stone is pre-Viking. We have the representation of the throught symbol, with the heads of three different animals, a wolf, an eagle, and a boar, just above the figure of a woman carrying two snakes in each hand. The snakes are particularly interesting. One of the snakes might be Odin himself, who turned into a snake to reach the underworld, to reach the place where the mead of poetry was kept by a female giant. He had to go down into the cave, shapeshifted into a snake. So indeed, we have in here the idea previously expressed of the snake or serpent as an animal of the underworld, and the idea that the dead go through a transformation, transforming into snakes to reach the underworld. That idea of the ancestors becoming snakes. You will notice in the myths that the gods always shapeshift into some animal when they must get out from their reality into some other reality. They assume the form of an animal suitable for the reality they must come in contact with, crossing boundaries. In this case, Odin goes down into the earth, assumes the typical serpent shape, as it was the animal associated with the underworld and fertility, but also the underworld as a means to obtain knowledge and power. So with this being said, the snake here might also represent Níðhöggr. But in the context of folklore of the Scandinavian Middle Ages, and actually folklore of the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages in general, the snake is the animal related to the protection of female fertility, which explains why many tombs of Viking Age women had coiled serpent charms. They were a symbol of rebirth and life. And I forgot to mention previously, but in many mythologies, the fact that the snake sheds its skin is related to not just rebirth, but a process of transformation after death. This is reflected in the concept of Náströnd, previously spoken. The dead go into the burial mound, into the grave, into Náströnd. They shed their skin like the snake, leave the bodies behind, and are transformed into snakes, into a form suitable to wander about the underworld until they assume another form. The continuation of life after death through the process of transformation. So, in this case, the Smiss picture stone can be interpreted as a great magical propitiator of belonging to some female figure, a goddess of the underworld possibly, or propitiating fertility for women in general in that region. Again, the case of Nidhogg, propitiating fertility and life, which is also reflected in Jörmungandr, as we shall see. The point here is that we can still see the snake in pre-Viking periods as a symbol of protection and fertility. Now, In terms of Thor fighting the serpent, or fishing the serpent, we have interesting depictions of it in the 17th and 18th century Icelandic manuscripts. This is obviously too far ahead. In a period of Iceland after the Catholic period, during the Reformation age, Protestantism was established, to be more precise, Lutheranism, and Iceland under the rulership of Denmark. It was an especially hard time, especially during the 18th century. And obviously, in terms of religion, it was especially oppressive, a great religious intolerance. So obviously, these depictions of Thor fighting the world serpent or fishing the world serpent were kept, as this image was already quite common already since the 11th century, at the end of the Viking period. Jörmungandr is the symbol of the world serpent that bites its own tail. This is an idea of an enclosure, the serpent of protection. It envelops the mortal world, and everything inside it is protected by the great magical serpent. It's the idea of stability and conservation of the natural order of the universe. I will explore more on this on a future video about the primordial myth of the serpent and the egg. Don't worry. The snake or the serpent that bites its own tail. The Scandinavians called it Jormungandr. And it is related to the stability of the world as it surrounds the ocean from end to end. It's actually a symbol of order that transmits safety. So why on earth would Thor try to destroy order, since he himself was the most worshipped Norse deity in Scandinavia, the most beloved, and he himself being also a symbol of protection? We have the Altuna Runestone, where the myth of Thor fishing the world serpent is depicted. It stands out in detail, Thor's foot going through the boat, and he struggles to put up Jormungandr. The Altuna Runestone is at Uppsala in Sweden, and it dates from the 11th century. Actually, most surviving runestones were raised during the 11th century. And you know what happened during the 11th century, during that period? The Christianization of Sweden. In fact, most runestones are from the period after the Christianization. So, as previously seen, in all the information I have given you, there has been indeed alterations in the myths several times due to the evolution of religion. Christianity, coming into the Scandinavian panorama, changed many myths, changed the meaning of the myths, twisting the myths to better enter in the religious mentality of Christians and pass on that idea to pagans to facilitate the process of conversion. A symbol that in pre-Viking Scandinavia and early Viking period was still seen as a symbol of protection and fertility, all of a sudden is turned into an evil symbol. In a Christian sense, making Thor the most worshipped and most beloved god of the Scandinavians, of the Scandinavian pagans, trying to destroy the very symbol of paganism, is just perfect. The worship of Thor didn't end miraculously. People continue to praise Thor for a very long time, even after the Christianization. The church was well aware of the love the pagans had for Thor. To facilitate the process of conversion, the most beloved god started to be the one destroying paganism itself. If the most loved god of the Scandinavian pagans showed a clear dislike for paganism itself and pagan symbols, why should pagans continue to be pagan if their god clearly was also fighting against paganism itself, against the serpent of protection and fertility that was now a symbol of evil? This change in the myths had a great impact upon the pagan minds, and the newly converted pagans converted to the new religion. Let's see another example, but give me a moment, I need a pause. Right, here I am, that was fast. We have the Ardre image stones, and in this case of Thor fighting Jörmungandr, we have the picture stone Ardre VIII. It's a beautiful example of a picture stone depicting many mythological accounts, many scenes of legends and heroic and poetic stories. And we have depicted Thor fishing Jörmungandr. This is also a picture from the 11th century from Sweden, Gotland. We have two scenes of fishing. One in the bottom, which is clearly a depiction of a fish, which I doubt it's actually a fish, because fish were indeed very important in the economy of medieval Scandinavia. But in terms of myths and legends, doesn't come that often. It was important, but almost everybody had access to it. The animals that are often depicted in memorial stones are legendary animals, animals of the religious world, which are often the animals associated with the gods, with power, the animals of the elite, the ones not everybody had access to, boars, sometimes stags, mostly cattle, which is the symbol of wealth, etc. Doesn't matter now. I believe this is not a fish, but actually a whale. In the sagas, whales are seen as a kind of fish, and fishing whales wasn't for everyone, which is why it is depicted here. Remember that picture stones represent images of myths, legends, and stories in general. And this is exactly where I want to get. In Erik's saga Ralda, the pagan Thor, whose name means the hill of Thor, this pagan figure prays to Thor, which results in a fortuitous hunt of a whale. The interesting part about this saga is that when Christians learn that the whale has been sent by the pagan god Thor, they disapprove of the meat and then pray to the Christian god and receive a bountiful catch of fish and other wild foods, as the meat of the whale was clearly poisoned. So in this picture stone, right above this scene of fishing a whale, we have Thor fishing, supposedly, Jörmungandr. This is the exact point. The pagan figure Thorr, comes most certainly from an older oral tradition in which Thor was evoked to bless and protect the fishing of whales. The pagan character is related to Thor, as it is expressed in his own name, and he prays to Thor. When this story of the oral tradition was finally put to parchment, there is a twist. Thor fishes or hunts the whale. He called upon Thor to do so. That much wasn't removed on purpose, so after this account, Christian compilers could give the twist. The whale was sent by Thor, and so the meat was poisoned. So Christians saved the day and saved people from starvation by praying to the Christian god, and the Christian god offered better food, a variety of foods and not poisoned. This oral tradition by Christian hands is almost certainly the account that served as the inspiration to make the account of Thor fishing Jörmungandr. Thor wasn't fishing the world serpent, the symbol of protection and fertility. Thor was fishing a whale. Or in other words, Thor, as the god of storm, often called upon by seafarers and to protect them in the sea, and also as a god of fertility and the common folk, Thor was called upon by fishermen and those who hunt whales, not only for protection, but also to have a successful outcome. It was a whale, not the world serpent. Thor fishing the world serpent is a Christian motif because of all the previous reasons given to you in this video. Thor propitiated fertility, plenty, protection. He would never fight against an entity that has the same attributes as he has. Does it make sense? We also have the Gosforth cross, a large Anglo-Saxon cross in the English county of Cumbria. This is another stone showing Thor fishing the world serpent, possibly. But must we say more? Anglo-Saxon, 10th century with a Christian cross. in Cumbria, formerly part of the kingdom of Northumbria, the great English Christian kingdom. After all that was said in this video, I don't think there is a better example of the Christianization of the Germanic or Norse myths than this one. I'm quite sure that the image of Thor related to fishing has been an account quite old before Christianization. But Thor related to fertility, propitiating fertility even in the oceans, where he was called upon by many fishermen and seafarers. So I'm quite sure there were oral traditions of Thor in adventures in the sea, in the oceans, even fishing whales, seen as great monsters of the sea, and only Thor alone can fish one out, showing his prowess and mighty strength. But I doubt very much there was ever a myth involving Thor fishing the world serpent before Christianization. Thor fishing Jörmungandr is the Christianization of the account of Thor fishing a whale, an account related to the power of protection and fertility given by Thor. And yes, if you are thinking about that, whales were very important animals within the animistic religious panorama of Northern Europe, which unfortunately I have no time to explore in here. But whales were important, and I have no doubt Thor was involved in myths with whales. The images of Thor fishing or hunting the great snake date back to the Christian era. But I find it curious that Thor tries to catch Jormungandr with the head of an ox. Perhaps the ox was sacrificed to Thor in a celebration of fertility in relation to the earth. As I said, cattle was the animal representative of the wealth of the nobility of the medieval Scandinavian elite. Jörmungandr in many myths is the symbol of the power and fertility of the earth itself, an animal often linked to deities of the underworld precisely in their sense of fertility. Thor is linked to the cult of the dead as well, since the vast majority of Scandinavians relied or believed that they would go to where Thor presided in the other world. Thor is the deity of the common people, the farmers and artisans, slaves, craftsmen, fishermen, who made up the vast majority of the Scandinavian population. The vast majority of social classes in medieval Scandinavia were waiting to go to Thor after death. They would first go to hell and then to Thor's hole or region if their social status was perceived to be within the category of common folk. We know that the cult of the dead is closely linked to the fertility cult as well. And of course, Thor is a fertility god. His powers preside over the heavens, rain, thunderstorm, storm in general, propitiating fertility on the earth. Thor's own mother is Jord, the giant or goddess of the earth. Just as Jormungandr, the name is related to Jord, seen as a giant. Both are gigantic and linked to the earth. I think at some prehistoric time before the Iron Age, well, certainly before the Viking Age, at least before the 9th century, perhaps Thor and Jörmungandr were linked to the fertility cult of the earth, as two forces acting together to bring about the fertility of the soils. It reminds me of the Celtic god Sukelos, who with his great hammer strikes the earth to give it fertility. Perhaps Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, strike on the earth will cause the snake to surface, triggering or distributing its fertility power to the upper world. Perhaps indeed Thor had hunted or fished the serpent, but not in the sense that Jörmungandr was an animal representative of evil, but precisely Thor pulling the great serpent, forcing it to give fertility to the land. Or perhaps the relationship between the two was friendlier, since Thor's mother is the earth. So perhaps Thor was in contact with his mother, or the serpent is the animal totem representative of the earth. As I have said before, the case of Níðhöggr and the winged serpent, the serpent of the underworld, perceived as the Earth's generator of life force. Also, I almost forgot. Let's not forget that Jörmungandr is an animal in the water environment. In Nordic mythology, like many other European mythologies, when it comes to myths and legends related to the dead and crossing over, we seem to have always this idea expressed of the need to cross water to reach the next world. For the inhabitants of Gotland, which is where we find many picture stones, this reality would be more noticeable, since they lived on an island, and to go anywhere, they had to literally cross the water. I mean, the Viking Age period is all about seafaring. We note that there are so many references to the action of crossing a body of water to reach the underworld in Nordic mythology. The serpent or dragon being the underworld animal, such as Nidhogg, may be behind this Thor myth trying to fish the serpent. As I said before, the serpent is associated with the earth and its fertility, and the fertility associated with the underworld, since the underworld was literally the earth under our feet, the world of the dead. Maybe at some point Thor really tried to attack the snake in its aquatic habitat. What I mean by this is that the serpent is a symbol of the earth, and it is linked to fertility, but as an aquatic symbol it is linked to the underworld and the dead, which in turn are also linked to the fertility cult within the cult of the dead. This water environment in the myths is the place between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the water that the dead cross to reach the afterlife. In water, the serpent becomes hostile to all those who are not dead because it becomes a symbol of protection, protecting or the protection of the underworld and the dead. In that aspect of protection, the serpent may have become hostile and tried to attack all those who do not belong in that world, that is, the in-between world, that only the dead can use to reach the underworld, or the world of the spirits. Jormungandr is the other aspect of Níðhöggr, and vice versa, as the serpent that lives in the underworld in the great underground lake or spring Hvergelmir. Just remember, the gods shapeshift into animals to be able to go through boundaries and reach other realities. What if Thor never shapeshifted and tried to reach the underworld, since in archaeology Thor is clearly also related to the dead? Thor was trying to enter the world of the dead in the condition of a god and not an animal, and maybe the serpent that protects the dead was trying to avoid the entrance of Thor, which was someone who clearly did not belong to that reality. Odin was only able to enter in the underground by transforming himself into a snake, assuming the animal shape of the creature that protects the underworld. Maybe Thor was trying to cross the underground lake. Remember the myth of Thor lifting the cat of Utgard, and the cat is actually Jormungandr. Utgard is the boundary between worlds. It's the outside enclosure. Everything outside the reality of the gods is Utgard. Utgard literally means outyards, the realm of the outside. Thor crosses the boundary and lifts the great world serpent in the form of a cat to deceive him. This account shows the power of Thor. If Thor had managed to lift the cat completely from the underground, he would have altered the boundaries of the universe itself. Thor was this powerful, capable of crossing boundaries. And if there was ever a conflict between Thor and the world serpent in the water, it's possibly with the same meaning expressed in this account of Thor lifting the world serpent. The water is the boundary between the world of the living and the dead, and the mighty Thor was trying to cross boundaries, putting himself to the test and testing his strength, power, and will, trying to alter even the boundaries of reality. But Jörmungandr, as an entity of protection that forms a clear boundary between the living and the dead, became hostile, not letting the mighty Thor cross boundaries and alter the way things are, showing in the myths that not even the gods can prevent the laws of life and alter the boundaries of death itself and the spiritual world, since the Norse gods in Norse myths are actually mortal and death comes to them. So indeed, they have no power over it, not even the mighty Thor. Anyway, water in many myths is related to the underworld, or it is a means of traveling to reach the underworld. You know this from the river Styx in Greek mythology. In the Norse myths, it isn't different. Remember the river Gjol to reach hell, the shore of Náströnd, the great pool or spring Vergelmir beneath Yggdrasil, from which all rivers of life flow, the well of Ardre, and so on and so forth. I'll make a video about that, about water in relation to the underworld. I should have done that already, as it is something very important to understand a great portion of the Norse myths and in relation to the afterlife and the conception of the soul. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, quite a big one, but a lot of things had to be said, and I have a lot more to say, but I better make some academic work about it and put it on Patreon or something. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video and that it was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag.